Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Lecture 2 of our course, War and Literature. Lecture 1, as you'll recall, covered the basic logistics of the course, where you can find the information, the readings that we'll cover, what are the expectations for the assignments. Today, we're going to start into the thematics of the course per se with a introductory lecture on the themes of war and literature that we'll be covering for the rest of the term. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I'll use the upcoming presentation here to guide us through the discussion, which I'll call up right now. So in today's lecture, we'll basically cover three things. First of all, we'll define our terms. What is war? What is literature? Then secondly, we'll go through a series of basically 6 themes that when literature covers the topic of war, we seem to find in works throughout different literary periods. And then a short discussion of the literary periods in themselves in which we'll find the works that we'll be covering in this course. So by way of introduction, just to step outside for a second, we're talking about war in literature. And when we think about that, we think about war itself. It presents us with unbelievable carnage and death and suffering that it causes. Yet it's also seen in some ways as that which can forge a community and its values, glory, honor, duty. So there can be both these negative and positive valences to war itself. War, especially as it manifests itself in literature, confronts us with human finitude. So war becomes this vehicle through which death presents itself, especially, as I said, in literature, in literary representation. So it's a way in which literature has to present or confront humanity with mortality, and in a way that the life of peace does not, so to speak. So literature, as with all realms of human experience, it's an important way in which we shape our understanding of these elements of human experience. So, and no different in war. So we, through literature, often we try to find, let's say, a meaning, or how does this have an impact or relate to other aspects of our lives. We're going to be studying 4 works in this course. We're going to be studying 2 works that are part of the ancient literary tradition. Homer's Iliad, written around 750 before the Common Era. Virgil's Aeneid, written in the period 29 to 19 BCE. And then we'll also study 2 works from the modern period. So Shakespeare's Henry V, written around 1599, and Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, written in 1925. So now to define our terms. Okay, what do we mean by war? So this course, when it's taught at the University of Ottawa, is often taught as war and conflict in literature. I would say, for a number of reasons, I've made the decision to concentrate on war. Just as we can see in this slide here, war in itself will give us more than enough to chew on. And there's, let's say, I would say a logical problem with respect to war being a subcategory of conflict. So there's a bit of a redundancy in that title. But anyway, if conflict in its broadest connotation is the representation of struggle between opposed forces and people, you could say that all narrative literature to some extent includes agents in some sort of conflict. So war and conflict in literature could cover any type of literature. The categories would be too broad, so we'll have to narrow it in some way. Again, as I said, there's often people will try to classify the types of conflict that can be found in different forms of narrative. For instance, gods against gods. So theomachy is a type of conflict one sees in certain types of literature. Humans against the gods or fate, humans against nature, humans against other humans, whether it's society or technology, and humans against themselves, so psychomachia. So as I said, we'll need to be more specific, and for that reason, we'll focus on war as a particular type of conflict. But what do we mean by war? So one standard definition, of kind of a giant of a figure in military theory in terms of trying to define what is war, is Karl von Clausewitz, who is a Prussian general and military theorist of the early 19th century, and his treatise on war is a real pillar in this area of thinking. So I'll go quickly over the Clausewitz definition as one point of departure, but I won't rely too heavily on Clausewitz only. But war for Clausewitz was, let's say, violence on an extensive scale. So there's violence of punching someone, so to speak, but it's the extensive scale of war that separates it from that type of individual violence. So you see a quote here: "War is nothing but a duel on an extensive scale." Another quote: "War, therefore, is an act of violence to compel our opponent to fulfill our will." So as opposed to individual violence like the duel or someone punching them, it's the imposing the will of a community or a state on another state. And there's only one means in war: combat. And so the function of war for Clausewitz is famously, war is a continuation of state policy. So this is kind of a very famous Clausewitz maxim there. Kind of summarize, to summarize the definition there, it says it must be a serious means for a serious object. And by that he means a serious object, it means it has state policy objectives. And then for serious means, he means using military force. So we can, by that he's trying to distinguish it, let's say, from what we termed, after the time of Clausewitz, let's say the war on drugs. The war on drugs, it's a state policy objective, so it's a serious objective, but they're not using, in as much as in the war on drugs, let's say they're just using, let's say, advertisements or social coercion, that type of thing. They're not using military means for it. So it's a war metaphorically only. It's not a war in the literal sense for Clausewitz. And then I guess the other more controversially, let's say the war on terror. So would not be, again, we have a serious state policy objective. They're using military means, but it's one side only. It's not two states conflicting with military means. So that's a definition, as I said, that's been debated. It's hotly contested, whatever. But it kind of stands tall in military thinking. But that definition, it can help us try to classify particular examples of war, of what we'll narrow down for our field of analysis. But we'll also want to get, let's say, some of the broader aspects of war as something that has a deep hold on the human psyche, that is beyond merely these rational calculations of state policy objectives, those types of things. So John Keegan, a famous military historian, I think puts this very well in his critique of the Clausewitzian definition. He says, "War is not a continuation of policy by other means. It reaches into the most secret places of the human heart, places where self dissolves rational purpose." So as I said, while Clausewitz can help us to define the sorts of phenomena that we can use, like we'll say the Trojan War, that's an example, World War I, that Woolf will write about, Virginia Woolf, in our last novel that we'll look at. Those are examples of war by that Clausewitzian definition, but there are certain experiences that are around those events that are deeper than, let's say, the Clausewitzian definition can encompass. So one way of looking at these, let's say, broader connotations of war can be seen in its linguistic roots. We'll see in the next slide that there's the linguistic roots for war in English are tied to notions and linguistic concepts around confusion, strife. It's tied to man, adult male, and truth. And on adult man, we'll see this, and in other aspects of, let's say, the war and literature themes that we'll discuss, how for war is a prime example where we're going to see the social construction of gender, or the cultural construction of expectations around gender. So the concept of warrior virtues that are defined by different cultures at different times are often, as we'll see here, associated with concepts of quote unquote manliness, or what it means to be an adult male in that cultural construct. So in the next slide, we see, this is a busy slide, and I apologize for that, but we can, I won't go through every kind of permutation on the right, but reaching back into the Proto-Indo-European roots of some of these terms that we have, we can see that war was initially tied to Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Germanic words for strife, or struggle, or fight, as well as Germanic words for confusion. Okay, and then, although not etymologically tied in terms of the word actually developing into to the word war, there's a close relation in terms of sound, or a homophonic relationship between the Old English were and war, what became our modern war. So for the word werewolf, for instance, we get that from Old English meaning man-wolf. And then again, although not etymologically related, there's a homophonic relationship between Old Saxon war, or truth, and our modern German word for Wahrheit, or truth. So there's these connections, both etymological and through sound, tied war to cultural constructs around, let's say, gender, around confusion, as well as these, let's say, cosmological concepts about, let's say, it's only through truth and strife, it's only through strife or war that something true can arise, for instance. So we have, again, these wide-ranging permutations of the notion of war that go beyond just, let's say, a rational calculation of state policymakers. It's tied to something much more broad and far-reaching. And we can see this far-reaching aspect, this kind of notion that war is part of, is a cosmic force, is an element of the nature of things themselves in the ancient Greek experience of war and truth and these things. So for instance, the Greek word for truth, aletheia, literally translated, means unconcealedness. So truth is experienced by the Greeks as an essential conflict or strife. Truth is, this is a quote from Martin Heidegger on this. So truth is never in itself, available by itself, but instead must be gained by struggle. Unconcealedness is wrested from concealment in a conflict with it. Okay, so he's articulating what in the very Greek word for truth is this notion that it's tied to strife or conflict, or let's say war more broadly. And this was articulated by the Greeks themselves very, very acutely, I would say, by Heraclitus. So this ancient Greek philosopher, one of the first philosophers, and these are Heraclitean fragments here, one of them being, we must know that war is common to all and strife is justice, and that all things come into being through strife necessarily. And again, war is father of all and king of all, and some he shows as gods, others as men, some he makes slaves, others free. So this notion that it's through strife that things arise in the cosmos, through war, let's say, so that it's this elemental force, it's this cosmic force. This concept, we see it in Heraclitus, we see it in the word truth. For the ancient Greeks, we see it, as we mentioned, in the etymological roots of war in English. This concept we'll see in Homer's Iliad in Book 18, where he describes Hephaestus forging this shield of Achilles that will represent the whole cosmos, and we have a city at peace, we have a city at war as part of this cosmos. It's just part of the ongoing nature of things. Okay, so in the more modern era, getting away from the ancient Greeks, there was kind of a founding debate in political philosophy and modern political philosophy around whether or not, let's say, war, conflict belongs in the state of nature, is part of the fabric of the cosmos, let's say, or is it merely, let's say, an invention of human civilization? So famously, Hobbes took the first side that said no, and again, this is, Hobbes would be in accord with the, let's say, the ancient Greeks and the classical tradition of thinking that war had been around forever, so to speak. And then the opposite side of this debate was famously articulated first by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who felt that violence, the human proclivity for violence, only came with the development of civilization, so states and these types of civilized formations and aggregations of human activity. So to quote Hobbes here from Leviathan, where he famously articulated his position, hereby it is manifest that during the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, so before the state, right? They are in that condition which is called war. So in the state of nature, before, according to Hobbes' framework there, before the state, they're in a state of war. And such a war is of every man against every man. By that he means all humans. I apologize for the gendered language there. In such condition, there is no place for industry, no letters, no society, and which is worst of all, continual fear and danger of violent death, and the life of man solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. So that's a very famous passage from Hobbes. You may have come across it before, but a succinct articulation of that position that there is, let's say, war that proceeds civilized state arrangements or development of cities. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as I said, came a little over a century later. In the state of, for Rousseau, the state of nature, man is naturally peaceful, as he says in this quote, and timid. At the least danger, his first reaction is to flee. He only fights through the force of habit and experience. So that's in a document he wrote called The State of War. And then I won't go through the longer quote from the Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, but for Rousseau, as you can see here, humans by nature are not violent creatures. They're not going to go to war. That's only a habit they accumulated through social interactions and institutions of cities, states, or civilized life. The anthropological and archaeological evidence seems to point to Hobbes, if we look at it at first blush, at least, in terms of who wins the debate. For instance, intraspecies conflict is so species battling one another is found in many species of mammals, chimpanzees prominently, and prehistoric humans. So humans before the development of cities and the states and civilized state structures that supposedly, for the Rousseau position, brought on these violent, let's say, habits and experiences. So say in terms of the evolutionary reason for this, according to these researchers, is this interspecies conflict can actually increase the evolutionary quote unquote fitness of the species through, competition is going to increase their ability to procreate and compete with other species for limited resources. It's also a limitation to population growth that could expand to dangerous proportions in certain regions. So that's on a species level. And then for individuals or groups, it's often accentuated where there's limited resources. So the group will be motivated to do that, or an individual when needing to do so for limited resources or for securing mates. So there's these kind of really, let's say, kind of really primordial reasons that you see in all life forms for conflicting with other members of your own species. And we see that kind of archetypal primordial urge around, let's say, securing mates, securing resources, especially around, let's say, securing mates in literature. So a lot of the discourse of the war, around the war literature is around protecting members of the opposite sex or your own potential mates in your group from the potential invader who's going to come in and take the women, take the children, take these potential spouses and offspring. So that's articulated in the liturgy. You can see that kind of deep primordial root reflected still in a lot of the cultural representations to quite recently. I won't show this video, but with the viewer discretion note that I have there on the slide, I will point you to this YouTube video that summarizes this Gombe Park chimpanzee war that was documented in the mid-70s. So it's a national park in Tanzania, and this chimpanzee war was witnessed by the famous primatologist Jane Goodall. So before she did her work there, chimpanzee life was seen to be this kind of Rousseauistic paradise, right? So it was seen to be this, it's pre-human. It's seen as this, pre-civilized, kind of city-state existence where they lived in peace with each other, with their natural surroundings. And then what Jane Goodall witnessed in this, obviously by the title Chimpanzee War, is this horrible kind of violent conflict involving the deaths of many of the male chimps on each side between two tribes of chimpanzees, a breakaway group from the larger tribe, and then the main determinant of the main contingent of the original tribe. The original tribe that destroyed that breakaway group, and as I said, it's documented in that YouTube video, which you can check out. The link is on that slide. Well, I'll skip over that for now. But as I said, before that, there's this notion of a Rousseauistic existence for the chimps, that it was an example of pre-human peaceable behavior, and that was kind of yet another example that was, let's say, blown out of the water by evidence. Excuse me. So we see violence in other species of mammals. We see kind of organized tribal violence in chimpanzees, And we see quite a bit of evidence of it in humans, from prehistoric archaeological sites and from current hunter-gatherer / hunter horticulturalist tribes. So if we're witnessing current tribes that have not had contact as such with other civilized societies, they will display these heightened, let's say, acts of ritual and otherwise violence against other groups. A lot of this comes from Lawrence Keeley's interesting book on War Before Civilization. So that in that book, Keeley's really trying to debunk that Rousseauistic myth that before the arrival of city-states, humans lived in these tribes that were living a kind of utopian, peaceful existence. And in the evidence he's looking at, and you can see in the right-hand side, the percentage of male deaths caused by warfare, so with other groups, other tribes, extremely high in some of these tribes. So the Javaro, this tribe in northern Peru, a very kind of proud, capable tradition of warrior virtues in this tribe, a very capable tribe that managed to resist invasion by the Incas, and then the Spanish conquistadors when they came later. So this tribe is obviously very good at what they do, right? They're very good at cultivating a warrior ethos, a warrior type behavior. And as a result, we're talking about small numbers here, but because of small numbers, the percentage of male deaths caused by warfare is exceedingly high. The Yanomami, so I think there's a typo there, Yanomami civilization as well in Brazil, modern Brazil. So them as well, extremely capable group. A good chapter talking about warfare in those tribes in John Keegan's A History of Warfare. So his book, it's quite a famous book on war. He does a chapter on their examples of their war with other Yanomami tribes. And what he wants to point out there is that it's highly ritualized. So there's not a lot of deaths in terms of numbers. Maybe it's just one or two facing off at a distance among the crowd of the two tribes, throwing a spear at a distance. Maybe one or two are injured or hurt, but it happens at enough frequency, and we're dealing with small numbers in the actual tribe. So it adds up to a large percentage of the population's deaths will arrive from this highly ritualized violence. So all that to say, again, so 2 points. These would be examples of war that would be outside of Clausewitzian definition of war, because we're not talking about two state actors. We're talking about human organizations that precede cities or are outside of state organization. And it also points to, let us say, examples of war being part of human nature beyond, let's say, recent or organizational or cultural constructs. So it runs deeper in the human psyche. It runs deeper in our, let's say, biological history than let's say that Enlightenment approach by Clausewitz. However, on the Rousseau side, there's another element to our human nature, and that is that humans were able to develop complex social institutions because there is also this dispensation that humans excel at in relation to other species of getting along with others. So on this, it's in the footnote there. I would direct you to Richard Wrangham's The Goodness Paradox. So Wrangham talks about two types of violence, proactive violence, where you're going out and planning to be violent to another group to gain whatever end, and reactive violence where you're kind of reacting to disturbances within the group. Someone's maybe too close to you on the airplane or whatever. So humans were able to be very high at their proactive violence without, at the same time, moderating downward the reactive violence, unlike other species. So they were so this sociability can manifest itself in a couple of forms. Reciprocal altruism. So we've been, our social organizations have selected for individuals who are willing to play along and see the benefits of reciprocal altruism. And also humans have this built-in desire for social recognition and shame if other members of the group, let's say, frown upon certain forms of behavior that we may be undertaking. And it's debatable, but maybe it's not necessarily true that we would see that in other animals. So these elements of human nature have contributed to, among others, but have contributed to humans being able to develop these extremely complex social institutions. Obviously language, a big one, and we'll talk about language a little bit when we talk about what is literature, but have allowed humans to work together to build peaceable institutions and large-scale social organizations. So there's been progress in our ability, given that, in our ability to limit the effects of war over time. So through the growing sense of its costs and creations of agreements on how to avoid it. And to quote Steven Pinker here, and I recommend this book if you're interested in this topic, but also another book somewhat related, is a more recent book called Enlightenment Now. He's recently put out, well, a couple of years ago. So his quote from this book, called The Better Angels of Our Nature: states are far less violent than traditional bands and tribes. Modern Western countries, even in their most war-torn centuries, suffered no more than around a quarter of the average death rate of non-state societies, and less than a tenth of that for the most violent one. So Steven Pinker wants to point to the better angels of our nature. So reason, empathy, compassion. So there's these internal drives that allow us to let's say limit the effects of war. There are also some external factors. There's a Leviathan theory. So the state itself, rather than being the cause of violence, according to this theory, is a powerful deterrent to violence. So a powerful central government that can make and enforce laws using violence means that the citizens don't have to take violence into their own hands to ensure that justice prevails and that, let's say, their goods are not stolen, what have you. So that addresses, so the state addresses the concept of violence within a group or within that state. But what about interstate violence, so war per se? So there are a couple of forces that have, or seem to have, led to a decrease in the effects of war over the previous centuries. One, a political reason, and one, an economic reason. So the first reason, the political reason, is this democratic peace theory. So according to this theory, and a version of this was first articulated by Immanuel Kant, actually, in his work Perpetual Peace. So for Kant, republican constitutions, a commercial spirit of wanting to exchange goods with others and to profit from that, and international trade and a federation of these republics would assure perpetual peace, according to Kant, and then later what are, as I said, what are called democratic peace theorists. And so according to that theory, and according to what the data seems to show, is that democracies tend to not fight one another for whether it's the political or the economic reason or both. And since we, well, last few centuries, since 1776, and especially in the latter half of the 20th century, we've seen a marked increase in democracies. So we have fewer, let's say, potential contestants in that battle. On the economic side, there's we call that theory a gentle commerce, the fact that states or individuals that are trading with one another are less likely to want to kill the other side or damage that other side, since they're gaining a benefit from that exchange. So so as the slide indicates, within a smoothly running political system, whether it's within the state or from one state to another, it's cheaper to buy something than to steal it, right? Or to get it violently. And so those neighbors, whether they're within the state or external other state actors, they're worth more alive to us than dead, because the exchanges are positive sum. They're good for both of us. And as you can see from the slide, there's on the right, we see the value of exported goods as a share of GDP. And remember, this is as a share of GDP. So GDP, so gross domestic product, world GDP, has been doing one of those hockey stick graphs where it goes along for 10,000 years, from the first agricultural villages, basically flat until basically the last 300 years or so, the Industrial Revolution starts to do the exponential hockey stick climb upward and to the right. That, and an increasing share of that, has been through exported goods as a share of that GDP. So as a result of these forces, so the internal better angels of our nature, as well as these external forces, the political and economic reasons that we just talked about, the relative threat of violent conflict has decreased significantly throughout human history. So in absolute numbers, the 20th century, in absolute numbers, worst by far in terms of bloodiest ever in terms of as centuries go. However, in terms of numbers of deaths relative to the total population, it was a significant decline, actually. So in 2012, so just some figures here, only 0.009% of the population were killed through human violence. So during World War II, around 3%, and again, that's a high point in the century of violence, around 3% of the population were killed. And then archaeological evidence of Paleolithic era shows that around 15 to 30% of the human population could fall victim to human violence. So going from a significant percentage of the human population dying or being susceptible to war, let's say, to, even though it's the bloodiest century in terms of absolute numbers, the 20th century, a rather small percentage or a decreasing percentage. So I think in terms of this, thinking about these in relative terms, I think Yuval Noah Harari sums this up best. In 2012, about 56 million people died throughout the world. 620,000 of them died due to human violence. War killed 120,000 people, and crime killed another 500,000. In contrast, 800,000 committed suicide, and 1.5 million people died of diabetes. Sugar is now more dangerous than gunpowder. So I think he puts that quite well. So all that to say, rather than being the cause of human violence and war, the rise of increasingly complex civilizations and states have had the effect of, say, consolidating authority under institutions, imposing norms and controls on human impulses and behavior. And we could say that literature has played a role within this history of human civilizations imposing of norms on violence and war. Ancient literature, as with all literature to some extent, so ancient literature, and it's even before the ancient literature that we have preserved, stories that initially arose as ways of, let us say, preserving what is highest for the community, articulating and glorifying what they held dear. And one of those would be for any tribe or early civilization would be values around preserving the community in the face of threats. So cultural evolution would ensure that communities with a warrior ethos and stories around war would be ones that would be able to preserve themselves. So both the society would be able to preserve itself, and those stories, because they were attached to a society that preserved itself, would be the stories that get preserved, right? So there are certain, let's say, in terms of cultural evolutionary drivers for why ancient literature would be tied and war would be so prevalent in this literature. And even in this literature where glorifying the warrior is so prominent, even there you see Homer, and we'll see it when we study Homer in the coming weeks, is that even there excessive rage and violence of an Achilles is critiqued and as portrayed as outside of the natural order. So even there, even in its earliest roots, literature is one of the ways in which a particular society is able to put limits on war, so to speak. And then more recently, modern literature has played a significant role in bringing to light the horrors of war. So think in terms that might be more relatable for us today. So if we think about Homer or Shakespeare as being authors, works, cultural works that told stories about, what was valuable for that society, told stories about how to make meaning of human experience, then the equivalent today for us might be film, where we see, let's say, a story being articulated in a particular way, certain actions deemed as valuable, that type of thing. So a Steven Spielberg is, a great director, can tell a story, Saving Private Ryan, about, let's say, the costs of war, that valorize it, but also valorize certain notions of courage and dying for the community, but also show a certain let's say, pointlessness to it as well. That would be, let's say, an example to keep in mind when we think about what literature at any era, just like, let's say, film can for us today, can help to articulate meaning as well as let's say, assign the highest value to things, as well as attempts to make the case for certain limits to humans' capacity for war, or our need to at least bring that within a certain rein and leash. So now, given that literature plays that role, so we've talked about what war is, we've said that we've looked at Clausewitz, it's not quite just something that states do, it's broader than that, it's deeper than that, it's lasted longer, it's been around longer than that. And we said that, okay, well, but societies have grown and they've articulated what's meaningful for them. And we've said, okay, well, they've used literature as one of the means in which they could limit the type of violence that they think that they should subject themselves and others to. What is literature if it's able to be one of these, let's say, cultural institutions that helps shape the way humans think? Well, so then we'll go to the next question. Having defined war, we'll try to define literature. Most broadly, again, if we go to the etymology, literature is from Latin, meaning writing formed with letters. So it's anything, literally, it's anything written. Okay, so it starts with language, and a literature is a written form of language in its broadest sense. However, what distinguishes literature, we might say, at least this was what I asked myself, you know, when I was thinking about these things many moons ago, is what would distinguish literature from a car manual or what have you, or I don't know, manual for your fridge or whatever. So literature, I think the first response that came to my mind is we would often think of literature as different from that, in that it's creative, it's innovative, it's doing something different with language than the car manual is. So the car manual is not trying to be creative with language, it's trying to take language as it is and trying to just use it as a tool. So literature in some way is trying to is a work of the creative imagination, we say, and is trying to be more, as I said, innovative with language. This notion of the creative aspect of literature goes far back as the ancient Greeks, who for literary production, they referred to it as poesis, meaning making or creating. So that's where we get our word poetry. So I would submit as a preliminary definition, and we'll unpack it a bit because I know it's wordy, is the following. So it's a linguistic usage, literature would be a linguistic usage by which meaningful possibilities of a world are articulated for the first time. And that's the creative, innovative aspect, right? So it's this first articulation as opposed to kind of merely exchanging pre-understood meanings of the world. And now using this, I'm building on this Russian formalist theorist, Viktor Shklovsky, who coined the term defamiliarization. So for Shklovsky, literature, the function of literature is to make things unfamiliar. So the idea there is that you kind of go through the world if we you know, in our everyday routines, and we have and maybe things and experiences can pass by us as part of the familiar. You know, I've seen this, I've seen that. And what literature can do, and what art more broadly can do to a certain degree, is take something out of that context of lived routine and make it unfamiliar and stand out for us. So we see it for the first time in a way, see it for the first time outside of its outside of that routine. So I guess another example might be, so if we take an ordinary language and we think of ordinary language as the communication of, you know, the exchange of meanings and values that have already been defined or delineated, we can take it as an example of everyday language or discourse. Someone might say, I've been hurt by intimate relationships in the past. So the terms and the ideas of the discourse are taken as given and predefined. I'm not asking you to rethink hurt or rethink intimate relationships or that type of thing. So in a literary discourse, one might say, love is a red, red rose. Its blossoms die early, but its thorns linger. So there, through the use of metaphor, so these poetic figures, right? We're asking the reader, the listener, to think about and look for the first time at love, look at rose. And part of the idea there, I think, is, you know, it's like a rose, it's beautiful, it's fragile, it can be fleeting, it doesn't last forever. And but it's also painful. It's got, you know, thorns, and that those two are intimately tied together. You can't have one without the other. Those types of things. It's an organic unity. So you see in the image, you know, love for the first time in that way, right? So maybe you would just say, oh, okay, yeah, I'm in love with you. Oh, yeah, whatever that means. You know, you get love, you get married, and maybe you associate it with a particular practice or what people do on a routine basis. But here, the poet, in this case, you know, and this is just me, I think. I don't know if I don't know if any other poets come up with these exact lines. So it's not great poetry, but is asking someone to rethink the terms there. Love, because it's like a rose, can it arise in a different way for us? So okay, so we'll just say literature for now. We talked about war, literature as this way of expressing in a new way or using poetic language to make us think about things in a new way. So this is an English literature class. So what is English literature? English literature refers to the study of literary texts around the world written in English. And then there's a nuance between this and British literature, which is British literature is study of literature in various languages, technically, but most in practice it's most often in English, but it could be in various languages from Great Britain. So that's the British part. So that has a national versus a linguistic focus. Okay. So English studies as a discipline is fairly recent. So I say this, why do I say this? I say this because I think the way we associate English and the way it's often practiced as this isolated affair with text is fairly recent, because it developed as a discipline for historic reasons and came to specialize on a small set of authors and with a small set of tools in its tool bag. So of looking at lines, looking for metaphors, and maybe not thinking about some of the things that we talked about when we talked about war, about how does literature fit into the development of human societies and cultural evolution, and what can biology tell us about it, and those types of things. And so English studies developed relatively recently as a discipline in the mid-19th century, where a lot of the humanities disciplines and social sciences developed out of a specialization that was happening within universities. And within the humanities, a lot of that specialization was driven around nationalism at the time, where people were saying, okay, well, we're trying to define our German identity, and we need to know about our culture, our German culture, our German heritage, our English culture, our English heritage. So we'll have an English literature as a discipline. We'll have history as a discipline. We'll have French literature as a discipline, these types of things. English literary study was seen as a higher calling and a replacement for religion, which was definitely on the decline, still is, at least in America and Europe. And it was seen originally as providing a kind of a moral and ethical and philosophical education that would replace religion, but also replace the study of the classics for those who didn't want to study Greek and Latin. So that's, let's say, okay, what is literature? What is English literature? As I said, English literature as a university discipline is fairly recent, but it's as a kind of phenomena, English literature is a subset of literature as such. Why write literature? Well, literary traditions obviously begin as oral traditions in its earliest aspects. And I already kind of pointed to this. So you can imagine humans originally wanting to secure the honor of a hero, maybe it's an ancestor, the honor and preserve the memory, secure the honor of the teller, but of the, let's say, the honor of the subject matter of the poem or story that's being told, and preserving in memory ancestral values and identity. So these were great ancestors, and they did it this way. It was always done this way. This is why we do it this way. So a culture is replicating itself through its stories. It's preserving ancestral memory and ancestral ways of doing things. This is how we always cross that river, and this so-and-so did it first, and that's why we've always done it this way, and don't question those things. Also, what's important about literature is maybe even more broadly than that, is this primordial importance of narratives. So there's kind of areas of research, but are areas of research called cognitive narratology, where the theory is that it's through narratives that humans define their own identity. Okay, so I figure out that, or I try to tell myself a story unconsciously all the time when I'm thinking about who I was as a kid. If I see a picture of myself, in no way when I see a picture of myself, am I that same person? And then I think about myself today, I'm got this constant story, and sometimes it's retold slightly differently with permutations, but there's always this thread in the background of a constant agent that's gone through different challenges that is being stitched by through cognitive processes all the time. So we could say that there's adaptive functions for narrative for the individual. So adaptive in the sense that it's going to benefit a species and an individual to be able to construct those stories and connect and bring a meaning together between those disparate points in time. So first, again, as I said, there's oral traditions and why a society would want to do that to preserve its ancestral values, the importance of narrative for the individual and for a group, and then literary traditions develop through use of technology. So as various ways to secure, even more securely than was possible through oral traditions, these ancestral values and the narratives they want to communicate. So so I remember we said literature is, any language written down. So literature comes with writing, a technology, so to speak, and the first being manuscripts, scrolls, and then codexes that we understand as books like this, but before that, scrolls. And then with print by movable type with the modern revolution, around 1500, that modern revolution. And then now the digital age we're living in. So increasingly, there's this increasing fidelity, so to speak, through these varying technological means to preserve those values and stories through literary transmission. So why study literature? Well, there's the pleasure of reading, is one. So we talked about why write literature, but why study it. There's the pleasure of reading, and of course, academic study is not identical with reading for pleasure. So there's different aspects to that. There's question of academic study in terms of trying to get to know better those authors and stories that we're studying. More generally, in terms of why one might pick literature as a field of study in their undergrad, and what they could do with that is, a broader cultural understanding, since there's understanding various modes of cultural expression in the past and present, and in as much as all people and their organizational expressions are stories to some extent, then understanding different modes of telling stories can equip them for all walks of life. And there's definitely a lot of anecdotal data, at least, on that to back that up. And then critical thinking and writing skills, I think highly sought after by, at this moment, every sector. So if these are skills that can be developed in undergrad, whether it's in literature, other courses in humanities, social sciences, or what have you, I think they're skills that will behoove an undergrad well going forward. In terms of the broader definitions that we were talking about, the why study literature, I think, has to go with if literature is this means of communicating cultural values of a community, it's good to understand what's going on there in terms of, as I mentioned, what are the stories' effects, what are their causes, where are they coming from, what is the benefit or the, let's say, the adaptive function for a society of following that story as opposed to another. Stepping back and looking at it with that kind of academic critical lens, in addition to the pleasure of reading, just immersing oneself in the story, kind of a critical distance to the story is also good to take, I would say. So the future of the study of literature, I would say, is the two trends I would highlight. And my approach is, as I've already kind of alluded to, is really interdisciplinary. I don't just stick to a study of the metaphors, or definitely we will look at that, but we'll want to try to bring in different tools from different disciplines, and certainly that's where the disciplines are going. Literary study is blending increasingly with other fields in the humanities and social sciences, as I say here on the slide, for instance, cultural studies. And it's been doing this for a couple of decades, women's and gender studies, critical race studies, but there's also increasingly crossover with other STEM disciplines and health and just evolutionary literary theory, which I've been kind of referring to obliquely, neurohumanities. So interesting field there, you know, what's going on in the brain, like attaching wires and electrodes to people's brains to figure out what's going on when they listen to a Shakespearean sonnet, for instance. And the other big trend, I would say, is advanced by new computational and computational methods in digital technologies. So a rise in what's called the digital humanities. You know, we've got all these stories on databases now. So what can we do with that data? And then that means, and go side by side with a quantitative approach to literature, rather than just, oh, how this struck me as beautiful. Okay, well, how can we measure that compared to other works? So that are a couple of the trends that we see in literature. Now, stepping back, we said, okay, what is war? We looked at that a bit. We looked at what is literature. Now, when literature tries to express the experience of war or uses war in its stories, here are some of the themes that I think, and this is one cut at the themes. There could have been a number of other different cuts. This is not the only themes that we'll see, but here are ones just to keep in mind at the outset that I think we'll see, and to some extent, in all of the works that we're going to study. So there's 6 there, and we'll go through each one very quickly. So glory, as I already mentioned, that this is probably one of the functions of literature in its origins, is to communicate ancestral values as well as to glorify the behaviors and the highest ideals of that society, including warrior ideals. So Homer's Iliad presents the struggle for glory as, so kleos in Greek, and honor as the driving motive of the characters in action. So it's front and center in that work. And Virgil's Aeneid presents this on, let's say, more on the plane of the community, where Aeneas is fulfilling his duty, pietas, in ensuring the future glory of Roman history. But a similar sense that they're being driven by glory, by societal expectation, and that the activities of the warrior hero are beneficial to oneself and the community for these reasons, and they have attached to them these highest values. So that's kind of the ancient response. The modern response to this notion of glory and honor in war is that perhaps glory and honor are mere terms of rhetoric used to sway the masses to go into war. And there's also this sense that the duty to one's family or to the gods is absent in these works. So, for instance, I have an example here. Henry V, when he's saying that his policy of treating the French citizens mercifully, it's driven, the rationale when he states that is not out of a sense of duty to respect their lives. It's not out of a sense of morality. Rather, the rationale is a Machiavellian one. So to more effectively win them over and control them. So he says, for when lenity and cruelty play for a kingdom, the gentler gamester is the sooner winner. So a similar notion is expressed in a play we're not going to read, but you may want to read if you ever have the time. Henry IV, Part 1, a famous play by Shakespeare, and a great play that we won't have time to read. So Falstaff, we'll talk about Falstaff a bit when we talk about Henry V, which we will read. He's not present in the play, but his presence is in the background, so to speak, of the play. So Falstaff says this on the eve of the Battle of Shrewsbury. So Falstaff is a bit skeptical about these ideas of glory and honor, and he says, "Well, 'tis no matter, honor pricks me on. Yea, but how if honor prick me off when I come on? How then? Can honor set to a leg? No." So honor wants me to go to battle, but what if I get injured or die? Is honor gonna fix my leg? No. Or take away the grief of a wound? No. Honor hath no skill in surgery then? No. What is honor? A word. So honor, what is honor? It's just a word. What is in that word, honor? What is that honor? Air, a trim reckoning. Who hath it? He that died a Wednesday. Doth he feel it? No. Doth he hear it? No. 'Tis insensible then, yea, to the dead. But will it not live with the living? No. Why? Detraction will not suffer it. Therefore, I'll none of it. Honor is a mere scutcheon, so an ornamentation or decoration. So honor is merely a decoration. It's a word. It doesn't have that power to live on and drive and give meaning to behavior. So this is a decidedly modern response. You don't see this, at least uttered this. You don't see it uttered this plainly. In it may be hinted at in Homer. It may, the costs or the hollowness of glory may be hinted at in Homer, but it's not, or Virgil, but it's definitely not articulated as it is here. So we talked a bit about glory as one of these themes, or one, let's say, virtue that is normally associated with war. Another virtue that's associated with war, maybe the primary warrior virtue, is courage. So the Greek term for courage, Andrea, is tied to the Greek term for adult male. Again, remember that notion of the cultural construction of gender and how it manifests itself in literature and thinking about war. So, and about let's say the warrior virtues being the manly, quote unquote, manly virtues. So here, it's manifest in the Greek language itself, the fact that courage is tied to manliness. And also, I'll just note that Latin virtue itself has as its root vir. So virtus in Latin has as its root vir, which is man. So similar in Latin and Greek. And also, I'll just highlight, we'll see this in Homer, is that Aristeia, which are these sequences where courage is demonstrated to an nth degree by a hero. They're basically unstoppable, where they fight at their peak and where they just demonstrate the highest courage and highest martial valor. And we might call it today morale, but we give it it's more banal, but there it's almost, they're divinely inspired. So continuing on courage, Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, is probably the best at articulating this ancient notion of what courage is, and he ties it directly to this theme of war. So courage is a directedness towards fearful things or evil, says Aristotle, but not all fearful things. So for instance, one's disposition to the fear of disgrace, that's covered by another virtue he calls shame. So it's directed to a particular object, and that is the object of courage is death, but not just any death. So death during a sea voyage, that's not part of courage. If you're being directed towards that, that's not part of courage. Only death in battle. Okay, so courage is directly tied to one's disposition to or behavior in war. The other thing to keep in mind with Aristotle and courage is the mean, and this is famous, in discussions of the virtues, a mean between two extremes. Okay, so in this case for Aristotle, it's a mean between cowardice and rashness. So being so bold to be reckless or rash, that's not courage. That's an extreme to one side. And obviously cowardice, that's obviously not courage. So the mean is that balance. And we find, and again, this is to this notion of putting limits on human existence, but also human behavior, human expectations, is this Greek notion of kind of a harmony and not getting out of step with one's place. Finally, I'll just point out that courage is tied to technology and tactics. So in ancient technology and tactics, courage is conceived of as a particular type of fighting that's worthy of glory. So in ancient literary representations, they prioritize close combat and tactics of heroic individuals or of phalanx tactics. So it's not necessarily just the individual, but individuals shoulder to shoulder with shields interlocking to protect the group, right? But either way, they're close combat and have engaged with the enemy in close terms with spear or sword. So missile weapons, bows, slings, are seen in the literature often as inferior and as cowardly weapons because they're used at a safe distance. So as an example of this, in the Iliad, Paris, after he wounds Diomedes' foot with an arrow, so Diomedes is bragging, I got you, and there's a lot of this in the Iliad, so get used to that. They're not really gracious winners when they defeat an enemy there. So it says Diomedes, never flinching, calls back to him, so brave with your bow and arrows, big bravado, glistening love locks, roving eye for girls. Come try me in combat, weapons hand to hand. Bow and spattering shafts will never help you then. You scratch my foot and you're vaunting all the same. But who cares? A woman or idiot boy could wound me so. The shaft of a good-for-nothing coward's got no point, but mine's got heft and edge. So note again that Diomedes' response emphasizes that courage and close combat tactics, as opposed to missile weapons, are tied to what is properly masculine behavior. Remember that we talked about. So he says, a woman or an idiot boy. So someone who's not a man, who's a woman, or a boy who's not yet a man. Those people can use bows, but only men are on the front line in close hand-to-hand combat. In modern texts, the notion of courage as a noble warrior virtue is gradually eroded. So already in Shakespeare, there's questions that is honor, is courage, like honor, a mere scutcheon, as per Falstaff, mere ornamentation. And then again, as we said, it was tied to technology and tactics. So in the modern age of warfare, with the rise of gunpowder and the kind of the marked predominance of missile weapons, we see a gradual change in notions of war and courage. So by the time World War I came along, the full implications, I would say, of the gunpowder revolution became apparent, right? So millions of people dying in these trenches. They're not really able to see the enemy. They can't get within 100 yards of them, being mowed down by somebody pressing a button across the way. So it became increasingly difficult to see dying in a trench as heroic, or as something that we would want to espouse as a kind of a high ideal. The other thing I'll point out is that World War I also brought home the realities of shell shock or neurasthenia as a medical condition rather than as a case of cowardice. So we seem to dissociate that both from cowardice, like the activities of the warrior were cowardice and courage are no longer attributes you associate it with. You don't associate it with virtue. It's just something that you plod along like a machine or any other kind of activity, a routine activity that's organized by a larger framework of technology, in a sense. So community as a theme, we'll see, is we have this quote from Horace, the Roman author of the 1st century BCE, dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. So it is sweet and good or right to die for your fatherland. So a quote that will come back a couple of times. So social cohesion and patriotism are tied here. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are some senses in which war defines community. There's Emil Durkheim found that during war, suicide rates in countries were going down. So people seemed to have a meaning, you know, or something was going on there where people and the community was brought together. In the Iliad, we see the threat to the Greeks is an internal conflict between Agamemnon and Achilles. The conflict, the war, is natural and is the order of things and should be bringing them together, but the internal conflict is the driver of the drama. In the Aeneid, it can be seen really as a patriotic poem praising the historical destiny and the greatness of Rome as it was united under Caesar Augustus after centuries of civil wars. So rather than, again, internal strife, let's show the roots of Rome, how it went through some great strife to found a city that became such a great empire. And then finally in Henry V, as we'll see, that it shows soldiers of different backgrounds. So all throughout the British Isles, Scottish, Irish, Welsh, English, united and fighting for Henry. So again, in the 20th century, as with courage that we already talked about, as with glory, it's more difficult to see for 20th century writers a redeeming feature for war, even the sense of community. So the sense that one was dying for one's fatherland, or the collective security of the community, began to be looked upon with distance, or ironic distance, and began to be seen as what Wilfred Owen calls an old lie. It's got to be seen as an old lie. So Wilfred Owen, we'll look at him quickly in a later lecture on World War I and literary modernism. But this sense is expressed well in his poem Dulce et decorum est, where he refers to that Horatian line ironically. Leadership, so part of, if it's about bringing the community together, and then that group that brings the community, whether it's the whole community or whether it's the soldiers on the field, in as much as there's a coherence and a social cohesion that's affected by fighting a common foe, then there needs to be a leader or a type of leadership quality or force that's going to guide the actions of the group. And again, we can see, let's say, different models of ideal leadership, ideal political, military leadership in the ancients and the moderns. We see in Homer and Virgil two examples of leaders. We see Agamemnon as kind of a negative example of a leader. He doesn't know his troops, and he often gives commands that are improper because he thought it was going to elicit the opposite response. Aeneas, on the other hand, is a perfect leader. He knows exactly what his troops need to hear. He's able to inspire them, rouse them when they need that, and makes good decisions based on listening to sound advice, based on deliberating, based on inspiration from the gods in some cases. And then for Shakespeare, I think we see as close as possible the ideal for Shakespeare, at least, and a modern example of model leadership in Henry V, who combines what we could call Machiavellian policy of ends justifying the means, or of looking at the most expedited route to achieve an end, that combined with a veneer of virtue. This brings us to gods and mortals. So war brings us face to face with our finitude, and in the ancient betrayal, we see the confrontation with finitude is what brings meaning to our lives. And so we're mortal because we're going to die. That's the definition of it, right? And the gods are immortal. They are without death, according in this Greek experience. And our actions and their actions are put in juxtaposition in such a way that it highlights the finitude of our existence. And this kind of, let's say, this contrast, it highlights the finitude of our existence, but thereby it also highlights, let's say, the value and the meaning of every action of humans, because it's undertaken in the shadow of being like a finite set of resources. So if you've got a finite set of, you've got a finite little bowl of pudding, each got to take care of each little spoonful, and each has meaningful, as opposed to if you're swimming in an ocean of it. So too with kind of the moments of life, so to speak. And this is part of the message, I think, of a lot of Greek literature in juxtaposing gods and mortals. And the significance, as I see here, of the Homeric similes, we'll see often the comparison is between this incredible feat by a warrior hero, and it's compared to what might be thought of as a banal action by a farmer, farming a field. Well, that didn't seem so heroic, by traditional terms. Why did he compare with that? Well, in some ways it's to contrast, but in other ways it's to say, well, in some ways that action's also heroic. They're both finite mortals. They're both spending a precious resource and risking their lives on that as having a meaning. And then by contrast, the gods, in whatever activity, but especially in war, their activities are of no meaning, because what does it mean to give someone, as I said, a spoonful of something if there's a whole ocean of it there? Then same with the gods, who they participate in these warrior battles, and there's no consequences of their actions. So in the modern portrayal, the question of whether or not one can find meaning in one's death is more problematic. There's no, gods are not present there as a contrast, and being mortal brings no sense of meaning. It's not contrasted, as I said, with the gods. We have this quote here from Ernest Hemingway, Notes on the Next War. They wrote in the old days that it is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. Horace again, that quote. But in modern war, there's nothing sweet nor fitting in your dying. You will die like a dog for no good reason. So that's very, very Hemingway-esque, so to speak, very pithy and to the point. Final theme I want to address is words and action. So the world of peace is a world of words, so agreements, debates, and the world of war is a world of action. And we'll see this dichotomy raised a number of times in Homer's Iliad. War literature needs to represent the action some way, and it needs to use language to represent the action. But war is, I would say, beyond representation in some ways. We can't represent the scale to some extent, and also it presents a limited experience, death, that no one can come back and tell us what it's like. So what is it? What is death? What is that experience? No one who's living obviously has experienced it. So death as this limited experience, and war in general as the presentation of death, means that, as I said, it kind of defies the limits of representation. So we'll see, this is where literature thrives, right? Is using literary tropes, metaphors, similes to say, well, it was like this. So comparing what is unexperienced, so comparing what is beyond our limits to something we know, and vice versa, right? So to help us try to make an association that will help us redefine our lived experience, but also give a handle on and help us to bring meaning to what is beyond our experience. And we see this in two, what I would call limit experiences of human existence. And we see literature thrives or seems to be very popular when it's addressing these limited experiences. So when we think of literature, we think of love poetry, and maybe we think of war literature, you know, as these kind of defining moments. So in each in its way is kind of a limited experience that's difficult to represent, and one leads to life and new beginnings, and one leads to death and endings. So we've talked about what is war, we've talked about what is literature, we've talked about some themes we're going to see in war literature, and now we want to close by quickly talking about the literary periods that we're going to find these works in. I won't go through every period, but just so we visually have a sense of how they're distanced out. So in this chart, we see mapped out on the left, we see the first works we'll look at or would broadly classify as ancient works. They precede the development of the English language and literary tradition. Shakespeare, of course, is the high point of the Renaissance, at least within English literary tradition. In terms of the colors, the blue and the green, that's to signify two core courses in the English department. If you were to take English literature as a degree, you'd take these two survey courses, one medieval Renaissance and one that covers the other 4 periods in green. And then finally, Virginia Woolf is in the 20th century, and in terms of literary periods, is this period often called literary modernism, so the first part of the 20th century. We can also think about the history of ideas, so I'll also be referring to, okay, within the classical tradition that covers both the Greeks from Plato up to Aquinas in the Middle Ages. That's kind of the classical tradition, until the classical tradition ends with the break of modernity. So modernity, basically the last 500 years. And we also can break it into 3 waves, as you can see there. And we'll talk a bit about that when we have a lecture on Machiavelli. And finally, I want to provide a little bit of what I would say historical perspective. So in addition to thinking about the literary periods and the history of ideas, also a sense of temporal perspective and how far away and how close some of the works are. Often we think about the past as kind of a flat, gray, misty, you know, we don't quite understand, it's way back in the past, and maybe Shakespeare's there along with Homer, and we don't put them into their kind of perspective in which some things are closer, some things are farther. And when we put them on a timeline like this, we can see, you know, Shakespeare always seems like he was writing a long time ago, and it was so far away from my human experience, is closer to us temporally than Shakespeare himself was to the Aeneid, and closer to us than the Aeneid was to the Iliad in terms of years of separation. So that is good to keep in mind. The other thing about this slide that's good to keep in mind, I guess, are some of the key contextual events and wars, battles that are being referred to in the text that we'll be talking about. So the Iliad is referring obviously to the Trojan War. The Aeneid has its immediate context, well, both the Trojan War as part of the story, but as part of its allusions, the Punic Wars and the Roman Civil Wars, and then Shakespeare's referring to the 100 Years' War, the Battle of Agincourt as the story, but in the background there might be allusions to the Spanish Armada. And then finally, Virginia Woolf is referring to World War I quite explicitly. With that, I want to close. I hope that has helped everyone to develop a sense of the themes that we're going to have for the course, and I will see everyone for lecture number 3. Thank you.